the last chapter of Britain's most infamous spy scandal can finally be told as the release of security service files reveals the long hunt for Kim Philby, the notorious KGB mole inside MI6 who spied for Russia for 3 decades. With me to discuss the findings in the archive is Jack Blackburn, history correspondent for The Times. Hello, Jack.
Good morning. Here.
Good morning. Thanks for being with us. The files span from the 1930s, and the documents include both Kim Philby and Anthony Blunt's confessions and reams of detail covering their lives as spies. Just remind us about Philby and Blunt and the rest of them to start with.
Yes, so these were bright young things in the 1930s, and they were all of a very strongly left-wing persuasion. And in Cambridge in the early 1930s, there was a extensive network of left-wing and socialist and communist organisations. And the Russians very effectively tapped these up in order to do talent spotting and to find young people who were, bred for the establishment, who were sympathetic. And so through those networks, there were chiefly 5 people who were recruited. There were more, but these are the 5 who became the infamous Ring of 5. And those were Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, John Cairncross, Kim Philby and Anthony Blunt. And all of them went on to go and be important figures in the establishment at different points through the Second World War and beyond. And all of them ended up being found out in the end. But after decades of passing incredibly sensitive information to the Russians, and in some cases that was, as Ben McIntyre writes in his piece this morning, with murderous results.
And what have we learned about how they operated then today?
So what we've really learnt is about the end of their stories. Really, it is the confessions that are now fully in the public eye that are really striking in terms of the colour. Some of them, in the case of Anthony Blunt's confession, had been revealed in part. We'd seen part of Philby's confession before, but it's now pretty much all there. There are tiny bits of redaction in there which may turn out to be crucial nuggets in the future, may in fact be just a simple bit of protection for something quite minor. But it is both the manner in which Kim Philby takes on his confession in Beirut in 1963 when his old friend Nicholas Elliott comes to confront him, and the manner in which he is seemingly sort of casual about this in many ways of his friend. And this sort of great mystery as to how he was able to do a fade, i.e. defect, to Russia from Beirut at that point.
When you say he was seemingly casual, what do you mean? Like he didn't seem to consider it a big deal? He wasn't alarmed that he'd been found out? What?
It was, in fact, the lack of alarm is really quite striking. Famously, Ben's written this in a book previously, when Elliot turns up by surprise.
This was made into a drama.
It was
I've
indeed.
watched this on screen.
It was
yes.
indeed.
Yeah.
Ben's very delicately put a small plug in there for it as well. But he has this moment where he turns up having crossed Europe to see Philby about this. And Philby, who had no idea he would be there, said, "Oh, I thought it would be you." So he had this, manner of being able to be sort of terribly relaxed about these things. He writes this confession, which is about sort of 8 or 9 pages. He does it in 2 stints, and it's very matter of fact, prima facie. Obviously, those facts are alternative in some cases.
Sure.
And there is no sense that he feels like he's under a massive amount of pressure. In fact, there's an extraordinary bit where Elliot says, you'll have to come to London for an interview. And Philby interprets this as you're going to have to come back from Beirut and go to London, and then that might have certain implications about what's going to happen to him. And this is one point where Philby does seem a bit nervous, but the way in which he says this is to go, "Oh, that would be a bit tricky. I've already made sort of holiday plans with my boss and his family, and also if I moved,
I think I'll spend the rest of my life in jail if I do that."
Precisely. He finished off saying, "Yes, I'd have to come home, and then I'd have a loss of income." So it really is a very bizarre way. But there's also this sort of dance that's going on. I know that Ben subscribes to the theory that it's quite possible that MI6 decided it would be a lot easier if Philby did disappear rather than having to bring him back into this terribly embarrassing trial. And there is this sort of delicate dance going on between these 2 men who've known each other for years. One of whom has just discovered that the other has lied to them solidly throughout that entire time. And they are exchanging pleasantries, but also definitely sort of sketching out what's going to happen next, testing the water.
Heavy in subtext.
Yes.
In the case of Anthony Blunt, who was the Queen's art historian, she didn't learn about his treachery, we now know, until 9 years afterwards, right?
Yes, this is pretty extraordinary stuff. So Anthony Blunt was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures in 1964, had been for a long time. He had been under suspicion previously. Two of the other spies I mentioned, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, do defect in 1951. This puts huge pressure on Blunt and Philby, but they emerge, well, certainly with their liberty intact. Philby does have to leave MI6. Blunt is allowed to sort of carry on at the very heart of the British establishment. And he is eventually uncovered in 1964 when a man called Michael Straight comes forward and says, he recruited me to the Russian intelligence service when I was at Cambridge. And that is the clincher. There is this fantastic John le Carré-esque bit of writing from the man who went to go and interview Blunt to get the confession. It's worth sort of dwelling on the detail. This will be in an exhibition at the National Archives in a few months in the spring. They'll be putting these on display. He says of Blunt, he sat and looked at me for fully a minute without speaking. I said that his silence had already told me what I wanted to know. Would he now get the whole thing off his chest? Blunt's answer was, give me 5 minutes while I wrestle with my conscience. He went out of the room, got himself a drink, came back and stood at the tall window looking out on Portman Square. I gave him several minutes of silence and then appealed to him again to get it off his chest. He came back to his chair and told this story. And Blunt gives a very full confession and then submits to 8 years' worth of debriefing interviews. Pretty much every week. And he does sort of come out with a lot of information. There is questions as to whether he was able to hide anything important, but he does cooperate fully. However, the palace had been informed that this interrogation was going to take place, and the Queen's private secretary, Sir Michael Adine, said, OK, I won't tell anybody else, because he'd been requested to. They didn't want to spook Blunt. However, the files show that MI5 definitely did not keep the palace in the loop about this. It's only 3 years later that Adine is brought, quote, up to date. And then there are further files into the 70s when there's sort of changes of personnel. So there's a new director general of MI5, and Adine is about to be succeeded by Martin Chartres as private secretary. And it becomes clear that the Queen knows nothing officially. And eventually in 1973, there is a health scare around Blunt. And at this point, it is a pretty open secret. The Sunday Times has done this massive expose on Philby. So they know the truth, can't publish it for libel reasons. If Blunt suddenly dies, no such problem. Yeah. So there is a panic in the Heath government, and it is at this point that the Queen is told, officially at any rate. What is interesting about what she's told is that there is a letter which is referred to by the Cabinet Secretary about the Queen being told. It says that Martin Chartres had spoken to the Queen about Blunt. She took it all very calmly and without surprise. Now, there were plenty of people who knew. I mean, Brian Sewell knew by 1970, and Brian Sewell, I'm sure, was pretty free and easy with the information. It was a fairly open secret. It would be astonishing if the Queen knew nothing about this. But at the very least, she had not been briefed and did not know the full extent.
Look, before I let you go, Jack, there's also some detail in there about the rules for spying, about things about how tall you're allowed to be and fake moustaches and beards and stuff. Tell us a bit of that.
Yeah, you and I are out. You mustn't be too tall.
Right. Well, are you not too tall?
I am too tall. I can't. I'm 5.
Alas, I'm not too tall.
You must be.
And this is a real beard. So I don't know what you're suggesting.
Well, you must be no more than 5'8" inches.
Oh, okay. I am too tall.
I thought you were.
That's very exciting.
And then you would be, if you're too short, that's a problem. You must have good eyesight, good hearing, and if at all possible, you should look, quote, as unlike a policeman as possible. It's a fascinating look. But I know some of the journalists who are looking at this said there's some good tips here for doing door knocks and door stopping people here. The main thing is have lots of spare change.
Right. Wow. Why?
Because you'll need to pay for taxis when you're saying follow that cab. And there's a whole thing about if you do get in and say follow that cab, you then need to explain to the driver that he needs to drive in such a way that he won't be noticed. Then you need to explain to him that this is because you're a jealous lover you need to give him a juicy story so that he can tell his next fare.
That all goes to show how badly they've been casting James Bond all these years. Jack Blackburn, history correspondent for The Times, thank you very much indeed. Completely fascinating.